Hi everyone! Today we are going to spend a little bit of time getting ourselves familiarized with poetry for children and teens, including things like lullabies, nursery rhymes, riddles, and jokes, and children's poetry. And then we will be talking about verse novels. And these were the books that you were supposed to read for the week, including The Poet X, and Another Day as Emily, The Broken Pieces, and Locomotion. So why are we talking about these things? One of the course goals for us is to articulate the value of nursery rhymes as an introduction to poetry and a basis for development of social, psychological, and linguistic values. And we also want to continue to develop our familiarity with quality children's literature and to trace the development of children's lit from early alphabet books to modern works. So, without further ado, let's get into talking about poetry for children and teens. First up, we are going to talk about lullabies, nursery rhymes, and poems. So lullabies. We often think about lullabies, and very rarely do we consider them to be poetry, but this is actually one of the first versions of poetry that people are exposed to. And babies have cried and or refused to sleep for time immemorial. Lullabies have existed for millennia. The songs soothe and comfort children because of the interaction with an adult and also the pitch and rhythms that make up the singing. So it's a multiple component here. It's not just about hearing the words, it's about the cadence, it's about the tone, it's also about the interaction that usually happens with a child and an adult when they're singing a lullaby. As I said, lullabies are the first form of poetry most of us are exposed to. We often probably don't remember the lullabies that we hear, particularly the words, but usually we can remember the song, and we sometimes have these fond memories in the backs of our minds about when we hear those lullabies later, or when we sing them to our own kids or nieces, nephews, all of that. So here's a lullaby from ancient Mesopotamia, which was around 4000 BC. You, baby, newborn human, you have now emerged, you have now seen the sun, the light. Instead of treating your father well and allowing your mother to lead a normal life, you have terrified the nanny and kept the wet nurse awake. With your noise, the household god is no longer sleeping, the household goddess cannot grab sleep. So, as we talked about, lullabies, what is said doesn't really matter, and this message seems to be more for the adults in the household as opposed to the baby, because the language tells us you've terrified the nanny, kept the wet nurse awake, and the gods and goddesses can't sleep anymore because of this wailing baby. So lullaby words don't really matter because it's the voice, physical contact, and the pitch or rhythm that soothe babies. But a lot of lullaby songs are addressed to the baby, and many of them are quite gloomy and dark. In traditional lullabies across cultures, we are seeing some common motifs. Parents have left the baby alone, the baby is hurt or dies, a baby animal is hurt or dies, a fiend or monster hurts crying babies, a fiend or monster eats crying babies, the baby is starving or will starve, parents complaining about conditions or about each other. And just like in other kinds of children's lit that we've looked at this semester, these motifs the motifs reflect actual social concerns. Throughout history, infant mortality has been a big problem, and this is reflected in some of these lullabies. And we see too the idea of fiends or monsters hurting or eating babies. Goes back to thinking about those legends and folklore that we talked about early on in the semester, where perhaps they're trying to teach a lesson that may be relevant to some older children who would be hearing the lullabies. In an article titled, "Why Are So Many Lullabies Also Murder Ballads?" Jenny Martyr gives several possible reasons. The lullaby is a reflection of caregivers' feelings, what the caregiver can't say to adults. So people have said that lullabies are the space to sing the unsung, a place to say the unsayable. You're alone, nobody is listening, and you can express the feelings that you're not okay to express in society. So it's this chance for people to be more honest with themselves, because it's like the thing, like nobody's watching, nobody's listening except for this little baby. They can't understand the words anyhow. So it's a chance for the caretaker to get whatever's bothering him or her off of their chest. The second reason here, lullabies were originally created as magic charms. By presenting the worst things that could happen to the child would somehow be protected from those things. So if we set up the worst case scenario, then these bad things won't happen to the kids. And just like I said, lullabies reflect the mother's fears that the baby will die. Infant mortality rates were quite high in the past, even as recently as pre-World War II. So this is something that is on mothers' minds and is being reflected in the words that they are sharing with their children. So here are a couple of darker lullabies from various cultures, and this is from 12 Creepy Lullabies That Will Keep You Awake. So here's one from Spain. Sleep, little one, sleep already, or the cocoa will come and take you away. Sleep, little one, sleep already, or the cocoa will come and eat you up. Russia, sleep, sleep, don't lie too close to the edge of the bed, or the little gray wolf will come and grab you by the flank, drag you into the woods underneath the willow root. And again, we see here, this is something that we saw earlier, again, in those fables and folktales, that this could be a potential way to scare children into behaving or scare children into staying in their beds. Obviously, a baby wouldn't understand these, but a toddler or a young person would understand them and probably be pretty frightened. I don't want to get dragged into the woods by the flank by a little gray wolf. That's not what I want. Non-violent lullabies were mostly written in the 1800s for the burgeoning children's book market, so this reflects the history of children's literature that we've been investigating all semester long. And in the 1800s, once there was a children's book market, more of these stories began to become popularized, and as we've discussed previously, a lot of them were sanitized so that they would be more quote-unquote acceptable for general consumption. So, the next step from lullabies is typically nursery rhymes. As noted in From Cover to Cover, rhythm and rhyme are highly attractive to children as a form of language play. Nursery rhymes and poems tend to present a highly structured world which helps children feel safe. By structure, we mean that even though the rhymes and poems are often about surprising or ridiculous happenings, each typically displays some of these patterns. So they're usually energetic and fast-paced, there's rhyming, we've got nonsense words and phrases, some of the characteristics may be young characters, elderly characters, discussing health and illness, being good or being naughty or bad, and they're easy to remember and repeat. While lullabies and nursery rhymes long existed in the oral tradition, the first verse written specifically with children in mind was, and we should not be surprised, religious. The first alphabets were often written in rhyme in the 1600s. In Adam's Ball, we sinned all, the cat does play, and after sleigh. An example of Puritan verse for children published in the 1749 New England Primer is the famous bedtime prayer that I'm sure we're all familiar with. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. As with fairy tales and legends and and lullabies, it wasn't until the 1800s that nursery rhymes were collected and printed in books for children, or that poetry was written specifically for children's enjoyment. So we see in the 1800s, when the children's book market really starts taking off, as well, school becomes mandatory and more children are learning to read and write. Some traditional nursery rhymes are based very loosely on people who actually lived. There was a theory proposed in the mid-20th century that most well-known nursery rhymes were about politics, famous people, or famous events, but this has been disproven based on very weak or absent evidence. So, for example, you may have heard that the nursery rhyme, ring around the posy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. That supposedly refers to the Great Plagues that swept Europe and England. And supposedly Mary, Mary, quite contrary was about Mary, Queen of Scots. And that may be possible, that may be real, but we just don't have enough evidence to make those connections substantially. So riddles and jokes are the next category of poetry that I'd like to talk about today. Children love riddles and jokes, starting early in the preschool years, largely due to the pleasures of wordplay. They also like stumping each other, particularly adults, and they also get away with touching, usually very lightly, on adult issues like alcohol and sex, even if they may not realize that. Children's poetry, as we've discussed, wasn't until the 1800s that poems were written and published specifically for children. It continues to be a very vibrant genre today. Children's poems can be written for or appeal to a variety of ages, and they address issues and experiences that children relate to and that children enjoy. So things like interactions with parents, interactions with siblings, neighborhood life, schools, animals, magic, fairy tale elements, repetition, and nonsense and exaggeration. Children enjoy poetry that contains rhyme, rhythm, and sound, and poetry that contains humor, familiar experiences, and animals. They also like contemporary poetry that has obvious meaning. So when we're thinking about children's poetry, we're not thinking about things like Emily Dickinson or someone like that. Children's poetry is much more simple and straightforward and contains information and characters and topic choice that would be appealing to children. One of my favorite poets, children or otherwise, is Shel Silverstein. And here's his poem, Snowball. I made myself a snowball, as perfect as could be. I thought I'd keep it as a pet and let it sleep with me. I made it some pajamas and a pillow for its head. Then last night it ran away, but first it wet the bed. So I am a big fan of Shel Silverstein. I find his poetry to be very fun and interesting, and he does manage to talk about some heavier issues in his collections of poetry. So if you haven't checked out Shel Silverstein, I really recommend him. And then here's another one, My Best Friend by Abby Jenkins. Black and white, thick and furry, fast as the wind, always in a hurry. Couple of spots, rub my ears, always comes when his name he hears. Loves his ball, it's his favorite thing. What's most fun for him? Everything. Great big tongue that licks my face, has a crate, his very own space. Big brown eyes like moon pies, he's my friend till the very end. So this is a cute little poem. We've got lots of rhyme. We've got lots of good imagery, lots of creative works to help us really feel like we're there. We can picture this cute little puppy with its big brown eyes and its sloppy little tongue. And this is something that kids would really like. I have included a link here too to the further poetry for children reading. And I've included several examples of different kinds of creative writing techniques that are showcased in these poems. So we've got some alliteration, repetition, metaphor, onomatopoeia, and then I've also included some poetry of specific cultures. We've got Louise Clifton, who is an amazing poet, Mary Nelson, who tackles a little bit more complicated issues. Here she's writing a poem about race relations and Black Americans and the KKK. We've got Pat Mora, who is a Mexican writer, and I love this poem. It uses a lot of onomatopoeia. Red shouts aloud, balloon round sound, black crackles like noisy grackles, cafe clickety clicks its wooden sticks, Yellow sparks and sizzles. White sings, I hear her high, light note. Verde rustles leaf secrets, swish, swish. Grease whispers its kitten whiskers. Silver ting-ting-a-ling jingles. Azul cuckoos like pajaritos do. Purple thunders and rumbles. Oro blares a brassy brass tuba. Orange growls its striped rollered roar. Colors crackle, colors roar. So that's just a really fun little poem that introduces us to some Spanish words and utilizes onomatopoeia to help us see these colors coming to life. So this would be a really fantastic poem for a young person learning about colors or learning Spanish. And then Joy Harjo, I included her as well. She's one of my favorite authors, so I couldn't let a poem lecture go by without mentioning her. So please take some time to read through these poems. There's a lot of great stuff there. All right, so further, we talked about poetry for children. So now we're going to kind of shift gears by talking about poetry for teens, particularly the format of the verse novel. And these were the books that we read for today, or for this section, not for today. So we've got The Poet X, and Another Day is Emily, Jacqueline Woodson's Locomotion, and All the Broken Pieces. And these books that I chose are really representative of the diversity of verse novels, both in form and in content, because they're all about such different things. So verse novels for general audiences have pretty much always been around since writing has been around. Even if rare, though, verse novels for young people have been regularly produced since about 1995. An early example is Love, Ghosts, and Nosehair by Steve Herrick, which, despite the amusing title, is a fairly serious book that deals with grief. Looking at verse novels for children and young adults, the greatest percentage were published after 2000. Most verse novels are aimed at the young adult audience. And interestingly, the genre seems to have grown up at the same time in the US and Australia, with the UK getting into the game much later. I don't have any speculations about why that happened. It just seemed to be an interesting coincidence. It's been speculated that the verse novel, told in the first person by the main character of the story, is an adaptation to or reflection of modern internet and phone technology. It's kind of a return to spoken, or in this case typed, culture that reflects the first-person immediacy of things like Twitter, Facebook, blogs, and stuff like that. And that would explain why it really started becoming popular for children and young adults after 2000, because that's really when the internet started taking off. Who writes verse novels? They've been written by both poets and novelists. Some, like the book Locomotion, make use of standard poetic forms such as the sonnet, but most are written in non-rhyming free verse. Page headings tell the speaker, the setting, or the day and time. So if we look at a passage from Locomotion, we can see a variety of different kinds of poems, and each of the chapters deals with a different speaker, a different issue, and they're written in different poetic forms. So we have an epistle poem, which is like a letter. We've got sonnets, we've got free verse, we've got different kinds of rhyming schemes. There's all kinds of stuff in here that showcases a variety of different types of poetry, which is really cool to think about from the reader's perspective, especially if you're thinking about teaching young people. This helps to make poetry more accessible. And then if we look at something like Another Day is Emily, we've got a lot of non-rhyming free verse. Sometimes we have rhyming, sometimes we don't have rhyming. So we can see, just by looking at those two books, there's a huge variety in how these texts are approached. So we know that poetry in general relies on the strongest word and the most vivid image because poems are short, right? Verse novels avoid long descriptive passages and share the heart of the topic. Non-rhyming free verse with its short and long lines, unpatterned lined breaks, standalone lines, and white space allows the form of the text to help the narrator's voice tell the story, especially in terms of mood. So these verse novels are much different than a regular novel because each word, like each word in a poem, is highly impactful and chosen for a very particular reason. Verse novels require authors to be very specific and concise and vivid in their writing because they don't have as many words to get their point across. Of course, not everyone values verse novels. Just like everything we've talked about this semester, someone is always on the other side saying that this is bad, or it's bad for society or kids, or they're just not good. Negative criticism of the verse novel seems to be based on its popularity. Because verse novels are popular, more people write them, which leads to authors writing bad verse novels. That's just what happens. Joy Alexander wrote the verse novel A New Genre, and she said that the verse novel presents the writer with particular challenges which may prove traps for the unwary. The handling of the verse may be sloppy, inadequate, uninteresting, or arbitrary. The plot may be ineffectively realized through the medium. The verse novel foregrounds the fact that the narration is voiced, which can give rise to difficulties. Usually there's a governing perspective with each section expressing the speaker's point of view, so there is little objective commentary, creating the problem of how to make things happen and to move the plot forward. The form lends itself to the confessional and to the expression of feelings, which raises the specter of banality or melodrama. Already there is an overrepresentation in the genre of facile teenage outpourings on sex, trauma, and death. So let's break this down a little bit. Alexander is pointing to some unique challenges for the verse novel. First is that the verse itself may be sloppy, inadequate, uninteresting, or arbitrary. So this same critique could be made pretty much of any kind of writing. The difference here is that the plot may be ineffectively realized through the medium. Writing a verse novel plot is different than a traditional novel because of the use of poetic techniques. And sometimes, as she points out again later, there's problems of how to make things happen and move the plot forward. Because these texts are usually told through narration, we get the perspective of one or more characters, which sometimes makes the action take a back seat, which can be challenging for progressing the plot and for helping readers feel like the story's really going somewhere. I think all of the texts that we've chosen for this genre don't suffer from those problems. I hope you didn't find that they suffer from those problems, but I could easily see how they slip into that. And another of her critiques here is that the form itself lends to confessional and expression of feelings, which can be melodramatic. It can be over the top. And we see sometimes that there's an overrepresentation of this kind of teenage angst about life. And I mean, I think that critique could be made about any genre that you're writing. It just happens to be a little bit more present with verse novels. So what does all of this tell us about the importance of poetry? Poetry and verse novels, just like other kinds of literature, are important for the development of children and young adults. They also utilize important elements of poetry, which help children develop their language skills from an early age. I also think that these kinds of works engage young people in different ways than traditional novels, which can increase their interest and engagement. And these novels are really great introductions to different kinds of poetry and different kinds of writing, which can show young readers that there's a lot of possibilities in the world and they don't have to be tied down to one kind of fiction. All of these verse novels are fiction, and they're presented in such unique and interesting ways that I really think that could appeal to young readers in different ways than a traditional text. So as always, I just wanted to remind you that if you're feeling like you need some additional help look, I updated my information here. I remembered this time. You can reach me at that phone number. You can reach me via email. We can set up a Zoom meeting or phone conversation if we need to. Remember you should be working on your writing project, your children's lit project. You're responsible for creating one project related to one of the assigned young adult books. So I've got some options for you here, and you can find this information, the link to these instructions right here on Moodle in the English 291 plan and instructions. So please be sure that you're working on that. We know that the due date for that is going to be May 10th. And still, there are resources. If you need some disability resources, Sandy Maynor is your person. The Writing Center is still going remotely. Librarians are still going remotely. So please feel free to reach out. And I too am here, and your success and well-being are super important to me. So if you need anything, please let me know, and take care.